Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024. Time for, I'll do one more last show. All right, and then we'll all just get off the air forever because there's no point in anything. I know. It's difficult to, how do you start a show in LOL, YOLO, nothing matters territory? Well, you bring Greg Dworkin in because he always reminds you that things matter, for one thing. But, yeah, it's increasingly difficult in the face of these idiotic, I mean, I guess you have to call them Supreme Court opinions, Supreme Court rulings. They look like them. They're in the form of them. Like the Electoral College votes, though. I suppose, well, for one thing, we don't know that they aren't totally forged. I mean, no reason to think that they are, but we don't know that they're not. Well, I guess. And these days, any suspicion you want can be floated and treated as a serious prospect. If you can just get the votes together for it. Like presidential immunity, for instance. Not a thing. Not written into the Constitution. In fact, implicitly rejected in the Constitution. But, you know, whatever. Today we find it. And it's cause for celebration, I'm sure, among the Trump ranks. The one they haven't been celebrating so far, I don't know. Maybe they just don't understand it as much as such. Or they're too noble. They haven't got the intention to do this. But, I guess this is going to be of interest. Like, this is now the ticket to Trump's ultimate dream, which I assume it has always been his dream to be declared the richest man in the world. He was very far from it, but I assume that was always his dream, that people would think that he was and declare him to be the richest man in the world. And I guess now he is, because, one, he can seize the presidency and call it a necessity and of national security. And once he's seized the reins of power, he just declares himself to have legitimately gained that power, and nothing that any part of our legal system can do about it. And then after that, once he's president again, he just says, well, let's see. I mean, I know I'm not the richest man in the world, and other people aren't saying it yet because math. So I need to get more money. Who's got money? Elon Musk has money. Or at least it's said that he has money. I don't really know why anybody thinks that, because I just declared that it's my money. I don't understand why you think you own that property, Elon Musk. I'm the president. I say you don't. You should sign it over to me, or you will be, executed for, like, national security type reasons. And, you know, I mean, he may opt to believe that and sign things over. He may opt not to and get himself killed, and then what? And then, of course, well, the lawyers, the constitutional law professors being taken to task all over social media today for pointing things out like, well, you know, it's not complete absolute immunity. You can still run into trouble as president if you illegally imprison someone. I mean, they do lay out what would be legal, and it's certainly a lot more, but there's also a line after which it would become illegal. The problem is, of course, that you can't use any evidence to prove the case of its illegality, for one thing, and for another, judges may or may not opt to declare something illegal, but of course, well, two things. One, they don't have the keys to the jail cell. So if you've been tossed in prison, awaiting your execution, presumably, by the president, and the judge determines that, no, this one was an illegal imprisonment. He declares it as such, but of course there are no penalties available for people who defy the order to release you. And the judges don't hold any keys and won't be releasing them by themselves, of course. And then, of course, there's the problem of, well, I understand that you want to rule that this is illegal, but if you do, I will rule you illegal and put you in prison. And that tends to change minds. It's how things work in dictatorships. And, right. So why not just apply it to everything? I hereby declare Elon Musk's bank accounts to be my bank accounts. But that's crazy. Elon Musk owns them. Does he? Is a court willing to say so? When you put it that way, maybe not. So, congratulations. Richest man in the world, Donald Trump. And anyone who says otherwise is curiously missing from now on, I guess. I own Amazon. I own Twitter. I own, what else can we own? I don't know. Why not, might as well, I guess, just take whatever Harlan Crow has as well and just say, Clarence Thomas, you owe your allegiance directly to me. I'll be paying for your vacations. P.S. No, I won't. I'm going to be keeping my vacation money for you from now on, and you're just going to rule my way because if you don't, I'll have you eliminated. I mean, well, this was a big job destroyer, really. Really, this decision, this loss cost us a lot of jobs. There's a lot of people going to be unemployed all of a sudden. So I've been looking at it from a purely economic standpoint, you see. All right, well, lots of other things to round up. I guess Steve Bannon, as we said, reported to prison the other day, but it occurs to me that I guess he's getting out. I don't know. I haven't seen him file this. I don't want to give him any ideas, but I'm sure his lawyers have already had this idea. He and Peter Navarro, I assume, are exploring the possibility of having their convictions thrown out because, of course, it was always their claim that they were what? They were acting under presidential orders, that executive privilege excused them from complying with the congressional subpoenas. It was just these stupid courts, these pre-Trump v. United States courts who were doing pre-9/11 thinking, right? This is now pre-Trump versus the United States thinking, or just Trump thinking. Everyone should probably just refer to any kind of thinking as Trump thinking from now on, because he's such a dear leader to us all. But prior to the case, it was the opinion of the federal courts that their claim of executive privilege and that Trump's claim of executive privilege, to the extent that he even said those words, if he ever did, was illegitimate in pursuit of a criminal conspiracy. But of course, there's no such thing anymore, and now they might very well, I really think that in the next couple of days you'll see them filing paperwork, filing motions to bring emergency appeals to the court and say, you just the other day said that there wasn't any limit on those presidential powers. He did express an interest in our hiding behind executive privilege. You can't look at his motivations for giving us that order, and so I guess we're out. And I guess, honestly, I mean, to the extent that the Trump versus United States opinion is a real, actual case that was actually decided by the Supreme Court and not just generated by AI and published as though it were true. For instance, I don't know. You can't prove to me that that isn't the case. It certainly looks like it. All of a sudden, this opinion has like 9 legs. I can't figure it out. Anyway, if it's real and real and binding, then there's really no reason why they shouldn't just be sprung from jail right now. And in fact, that Peter Navarro can't sue the federal government for falsely imprisoning him all of this time as well. So it's a very new and exciting frontier in legal adventures that we could explore. Pretty much, you could look at every news story there is today through this lens and just imagine a different outcome in which, pick a story at random. It's a story about a company that's selling a new product. Donald Trump owns that company, let's just say. He doesn't right now, but let's just say that the president declares that he does, then he does. He owns it, and he's a brilliant inventor. That hurricane did hit Alabama. NOAA says so. That's what the records say now, because we declare it to be true. Take your pick. Doesn't matter. Yankees beat the Red Sox. Well, we're dissolving the Yankees. Or I own the Yankees now. Or I own both teams now, and they're both dissolved. Or they only play games on the White House lawn when I get free hot dogs. Whatever. Kind of, So the point is there's not much limitation on this. And we can have great time with it, so long as we're the president, which we are. Honestly, I mean, you don't know I'm not the president yet. Pretty soon, by the end of the show, if I can raise the army, I'm the president, and all of that immunity falls to me. Big party at my house at that point. Okay, good morning to Greg Dworkin, who may or may not be the president. I don't know, and I can't ask about his motivations either.
Sure you can. You just can't use it, legally.
Right. Oh, that's true. I can ask, but I can't use it. But also I can be murdered for asking, but, I can ask. So, whatever. Forget it, right? Exactly. No more news. That's enough.
Yeah,
No point.
Nina Totenberg had a really interesting observation about these justices.
Well, she's under arrest.
Not yet, but
all right. Yes. Well, what time is
in
it?
January.
Okay.
But
I
for
declare
now,
it to be January.
She can speak her mind and tell her truth. And she basically said, she's been a court watcher for a long time. Oh. And with the exception of Barrett, who had at least some minor disagreement about being able to use evidence in a court of law when it's clearly important, she said the other justices basically grew up and, sharpened their teeth on working for a White House. Whether it was in the OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel, I think Roberts was there. Kavanaugh has done his stretch. All of them have at one point or another. That's what they came out of. And so they saw a Nixonian White House under distress and being attacked, and they just wanted to make sure that never happened again. Wrongly, mind you.
Yeah.
But that was completely and totally their intent. So me, a non-lawyer, looked at what they did and said, it seems pretty obvious to me, who remembers Nixon, that basically what they tried to do is take every aspect of the Nixon case and write in protections and reversals.
Yeah.
So, John Dean, Alexander Butterfield had tapes. Well, we'll make sure that can't be used.
Yeah, forget that.
Nixon said if the president does it, it's not illegal. Well, we'll make sure that that's in fact the case.
Yeah. Why not?
They went out of their way to rewrite Watergate in every way, shape, or form, which, again, for somebody who was there at the time, living, voting, experiencing, not being in the White House, I was too young.
Yeah.
This is incredibly distressing because the aftermath of Watergate was good.
It was.
And what they did is bad.
Yeah. What's interesting, too, though, about that observation about all of these conservative justices who served in the executive branch, and so they'll naturally be inclined towards increasing the power of the other branch that they used to work in. Not, of course, at the expense of the judicial branch. They also expanded their power immensely. But these are people who... There's always been a movement on to relitigate Watergate. We keep coming back to that theme, and it gets said on the show, and it's been part of the Daily Kos writing for years that this is what they were after. But what's interesting is that these aren't, of course, the original players. The original players are long since retired and in many cases dead. But these are people who came out of the White House and the executive branch post Watergate, though, where the consensus was that, Watergate actually bad, and all of the doctrine that they used to try to justify it, wrong. And in that atmosphere, they were brought up and taught, no, this is all upside down and backwards, and your mission, this isn't, personal vengeance because you lost your job or your president was displaced. You came up in the White House and the executive branch many years after this was already done. But you will one day, you will be my vengeance, say the fathers, I guess, and the mentors and the teachers of Clarence Thomas and Alito and Roberts and the rest of them. That wasn't their fight. They too were too young to have been in the White House and the executive branch then, but they saw what everyone else saw and said, I'm going to one day stand it all on its head. You'll all see, you'll all pay. I was right.
It wasn't just Nixon, it was also Reagan.
Yes, true. I mean, he was on the project of reversing Watergate.
Right, but also, trying to protect him from the Iran-Contra thing.
Right. Well, of it.
By the way, for you kids, you can Google Iran-Contra.
Yes, that was, It
was a controversy.
Yes, and one of I guess in some ways you can point to it as sort of the beginning of the end. Probably the first major constitutional crisis that they succeeded in getting the American public to say meh about. And then
they succeeded in getting away.
More after that. Yeah, so that was kind of
one of the many reasons
we had one every 15 years
to the Reagan administration as being a shining city on a hill that we should all aspire to.
Yes.
I thought the Reagan administration was awful.
Yeah, many people did.
What, wasn't that the ketchup is a vegetable, so don't worry about your school lunch stuff?
Yeah, that came out of them. And then, of course, Donald Trump then, of course, became a great ketchup lover as a result. And now look what happens. Well, I mean, when he's not throwing it against the wall.
So, one can despair at the courts, but until or unless you have enough people in Congress who are willing to do something about it, which means you need a Democratic majority in both houses and a Democratic president. If you don't have those things, nothing's going to be done. If you do, there's no guarantee there's something will be done, but at least you have a fighting chance.
Yeah, well, you might, and you have a chance, and they may fight you and kill you while you take your chance. But you could also surrender, and that sucks.
No, that you can't do that.
I mean, you can.
Surrender's not an option.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then we'll just write it down here under not an option. But it is here written, just so you all look and see.
Anyway, there's that. But, we still have to, of course, for all the discussion about the Supreme Court, we still got to talk about the grandpa elephant in the room today.
Okay.
Because that's a big and major story.
Yeah. Now, Trump could declare that it's not, but he doesn't want to.
Well, he can't until January. So... we still got a lot of stuff to discuss.
I now declare it January.
So Joe Biden has this terrible debate. And as we talked about on Monday, the reverberations haven't stopped. In fact, they've only gotten worse. Why is that? One reason is you can't unsee what you saw.
Okay.
Between Monday and today, have you actually had a chance to see any of the debate?
A chance? There was a chance.
There was a chance. Did you do it? Did you take that? Did you grab the opportunity?
I didn't. I mean,
you got to go look at least at the first 5 minutes or 10 minutes because, we need to have it as a practical basis of discussion.
My children need wine. I'm very busy.
I know you don't want to, but you got to look.
All right. Now? Should I?
No, but you got to do it for tomorrow's show.
Okay. Tomorrow's show is a question mark, isn't it? Well, it may be our last July 4th. You want to go and have a good time, right?
There is no tomorrow show.
There is no tomorrow.
You got to do it by Monday's show.
Okay. Well, that's the next one that you're coming back
if you can keep it. A show if you can keep it.
So I should watch
Franklin to you on the internet.
Yes.
So don't believe everything you read on the internet. In any case.
All cases.
Biden had a terrible night, and you can't unsee what you saw. And the worry...
That's why I didn't see it.
I got you
won.
there, right? That's why you have to watch.
Point to temple meme. There. Okay.
Right, yes. This feels like a night at the opera, haggling over a contract. So the thing is, you have to appreciate that those who saw what they saw are worried that Biden was sundowning.
Yes.
That
people were worried about that.
Elderly folks and some not so elderly folks get into the evening and nighttime, they sometimes get a little disoriented. Made worse by antihistamines because he had a cold? Maybe.
Mm-hmm. Or polonium.
Or any one of a number of things. But people were shocked and worried about what they saw, and it raised all sorts of questions about whether Biden is in fact up to taking the case to Trump from now until November. And that's the concern.
Oh, right.
And so the media jumped all over this because they saw what they saw, and they can't unsee what they saw. And Democrats, on the one hand, are very angry at the press, justifiably so, for making it far worse than it is. And they say, this is just the Hillary email thing. But it's not. There's so much more substance behind the worry that you can't just blow it off. I thought Josh Marshall had some of the most cogent, as he often does, comments about this.
Well,
said that he thinks it's about the optics, and it doesn't solve anything to say so. But
yes,
what should you do? And he's talking out loud, and he's saying, I don't have cogent recommendations. But his gut reaction is switching is bad because it just opens up the chaos door.
Sure, I understand that as well.
On the other hand, you have to appreciate that people really are concerned. So among the things he said, a few TPM readers, that's Talking Points Memo, his website, right, said, "Hey, I appreciate you joining Team Dropout." And he said, "I haven't joined Team Dropout. I've joined the team of I'm keeping an open mind and I'm going to see what evidence develops, but I remain really skeptical of doing anything besides forging ahead with Biden." So that means I'm skeptical that this represents a crisis of electability for Biden. I personally think he's wrong about that.
Okay.
And then he goes on to say, "But having spoken with a large number of TPM readers, I have no doubt this has created a major, major crisis of confidence for many supporters. I've read many emails from TPM readers who've said, I've always said the idea of replacing Biden was absurd, and then I watched the debate, and now I think he needs to leave the race."
Mike, it's still absurd. You just think it's better than the alternative.
You haven't seen the debate.
Well, I'm just saying it's absurd in the sense of like, well, we've not done this, and we'd have to construct a whole process out of thin air. But you do feel this way.
And that's why it would have to be Harris, and that's why I'll get to that.
Okay.
So total about face. The campaign needs to find a way to get these people back on board. And, of course, they're going to vote for whoever runs on the Democratic ticket no matter what. But that radical loss of confidence needs to be fixed. You need a lot more from your core supporters than just showing up to vote. And, somebody has to put out those yard signs.
That's right.
And the campaign needs to repair that damage. I'm pretty certain that doesn't mean some kind of apology tour, as some suggest, and it's not really a matter of explaining. It's a show, don't tell. And it's a matter of getting out and campaigning aggressively and letting that speak for itself. Then he goes on to point out that some of the media is just awful. And he says, I'm not going to name them, but I've seen a lot of really respected columnists, not just respected, but people who are good, saying Biden should step down. And everyone I've read reads with a level of grandiosity that I found weak, reactive, and vain, and that's his 2 cents. And for that, I'll also throw in one of my favorite congressional reporters, Pablo Manriquez, who, as he points out, was born under Pinochet, and he knows all about dictators, so don't lecture him. And he says, Twitter family complaining about the political press coverage of Biden, in all humility, you ain't wrong. Please know that most of us do our very best on the beats, but there's no denying the perverse incentives here. A second Trump term is the meal ticket for Beltway newsrooms, many of which are financially on death's door. If and when Trump wins, we in the press in Washington are going to do very well, even especially if his second term is a complete catastrophe for the nation. So that's, Marshall's not wrong. Josh is not wrong about looking at, the incentives of the press. Given that, though, Ben Yellen, one of my favorite practicing lawyer type follows, liberal Democrat, on Twitter notes the polling, including the CBS poll this morning, which shows that pre-debate Biden and Trump were 48-48. Today it's nationally. Biden was 48 nationally and 48 in the battlegrounds, and today he is losing to Trump at 50 and 51 in the battlegrounds. So, in other words, last month, Biden was winning 50-48 in the battlegrounds, and now he's losing 49-51. That's not a huge change. That's actually well within margin of error.
Yes.
And so the point isn't that the polls have changed that much. They really haven't. There's a listing of this is now 8 post-debate polls, and they show hardly any movement whatsoever. And that's not the point. As Ben Yellen says, which is what I was going to get to, the polling seems to be survivable. It's a normal bad debate bounce. What happens during the polling is that the people who are despondent about what they saw tend not to answer the polls for a couple of weeks because, I can't, And so the winner winds up picking a few points that is meaningless as time goes on. And that's probably what's happening here. If there's a change at all, it's not really meaningful. However, the problem, Ben goes on to say, is what Biden and his team have done since the debate, which is the opposite of building confidence. So Biden didn't do the full Ginsburg, Ben Ginsburg, that is, and go on all 5 talk shows on Sunday explaining why this was nonsense. And he hasn't gone to do a schmoozing tour, which is what he is best at, with congressional leadership.
Okay.
He hasn't done those things. And those are the things you'd expect a candidate who was wrongly accused of not being up to the task would naturally do. And the absence of him doing that is only raising more doubts. He's only this evening talking with Democratic governors. He's only on Friday, to be released Sunday, going to do a sit-down with Stephanopoulos, which we all now hope goes okay. Mm-hmm. But that's not reassuring. None of that is. It only brings up the question of, is he not doing it because he can't do it? Wow. Which is horrible. That's not what your campaign is supposed to be doing.
No, you don't want that. I mean,
you don't want
if he does have a cold, then I guess that's why it would happen, but you don't want it.
So this is from Punchbowl News, again a gossip sheet, and I don't think they make up these quotes. Democrats are also angry with White House and Biden campaign aides. A Democratic senator who was granted anonymity to candidly assess the situation told us that, quote, we kind of just feel lied to, end quote, about the president's condition. They've been shielding him from those types of settings for months, and even after it became undeniable, they're still lying to us, the Democratic senator said. There's just a lot of frustration right now in the caucus. A common theme among our conversations with Democrats is that they believe more lawmakers will follow the lead of Lloyd Doggett, Texas, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, Washington, Jared Golden, Maine, in questioning whether Biden should stay on the ticket or openly declaring he can't beat Trump. Golden didn't say Biden should drop out. He just said, you know, Trump's probably going to win. I'm okay with it. Everybody really angry with him.
Right. I mean, for picking up influence and moving the Democratic caucus, it probably was a pretty poorly worded statement.
Biden hasn't done an interview since the debate, despite the public pleadings. This is all terrible. And that's his campaign staff, or can he really not do it?
Yeah, or does he really have a cold and it'll take a couple of days?
Not good enough.
Yeah, well, it could be real.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We continue with this roundup. There's much more, lots to be discussed. Plenty of people going on the record, a lot of people hiding from the record, but still saying pretty much the same thing. And it's understandable why. You're going to incur some wrath if you do that, even if you're right.
Well, you know, we pride ourselves on being the reality-based community. So, as I said, this is the grandpa elephant in the room, and we have to talk about it. And I know that Democratic leaders, which is to say our elected officials in Washington and statewide, for sure, are talking about this. And they're very concerned. They feel like Biden is losing right now, even though the polls don't necessarily reflect it. That's important because this is not a race we can't win. Mm-hmm. What they're saying is that it's a race where at the moment we're not winning. And those are two very different things. So there's actually reason to be optimistic about the fall, but not on the current trajectory. And that's what this discussion is all about. This is from a different piece from Notice, N-O-T-U-S, new website, relatively new news website, but with some familiar names. This is not going to just blow over. Debate panic hardens into an awkward choice for Democrats. The Democratic Party is divided into two camps, those resigned to Biden's candidacy and those who think there's still time to shake things up. And then they go on to point out Lloyd Doggett, becoming the first Democrat in Congress to officially call on Biden to step down, another House Democrat told Notice they expect many more Democratic lawmakers and donors speaking out very soon. So you can expect that. I've spoken to at least half a dozen colleagues who are getting near unanimous feedback from their biggest supporters that an intervention is needed, this lawmaker said. Everyone had the feeling of dread that no one close to Biden will tell him the truth. And by the time the polling and everything else is obvious, it's too late. This is not going to just blow over, the Democratic member added. And if somehow it does, we are really screwed, except that's not the word he used.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well. Okay. I mean, I don't know.
So on the good side, Biden showed up at a well-reviewed campaign rally and a short Monday night speech about the Supreme Court's ruling, which was 4 minutes and on a teleprompter. He did fine. But he hasn't taken questions or done a media interview since his disastrous performance Thursday night, and he's made no indication he's thinking of quitting the race, even if the polls already showing him losing get worse. His campaign has begun a furious effort to foam the runway in case of bad numbers in the coming days.
Oh, okay.
In short, some of the operatives say most of the things that need to be done to end panic have been done. It's just that the sense of dread remains. And then they go on to talk about the options. There's only one option. He steps down and Harris is a candidate. And the reason I say that, it's not that Biden has to step down. What I'm saying is that if he does step down, the only option is going to be Harris.
There
is no other option besides Harris.
It's the most reasonable and likely.
Well, not only reasonable, but necessary. Our good friend Dana, remember Dana?
Yes, of course. No, I don't. I changed my mind.
David and I have known Dana for 15 plus years. Dana is a ex-chief of staff in Congress, and an ex-campaign manager multiple times, winning campaigns, I would add. And he writes this yesterday: Democrats cannot nominate anybody except Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. It's impossible.
Okay, how does he mean?
If the Biden candidacy ends, so does the Biden campaign. It's not transferable. Anyone else other than possibly Kamala Harris would have to start from nothing, and that can't be done. It's possible I'm missing something. There's some humility from Dana. That's always nice.
Okay.
But I don't think so. Here's why the Democrats can nominate Joe Biden or possibly Kamala Harris, but nobody else. There's only one candidate with a 2024 presidential campaign committee registered with the Federal Election Commission. And remember, until January, there are still rules. Some of the stuff of the Biden campaign can probably be transferred to the DNC and maybe state parties, but most of it can't. Another candidate can't just take over Biden's campaign. So think about it. A new nominee would not have a campaign, not a tax ID, not a bank account, not a website, not an address. There'd be nothing. They'd start out largely paralyzed for weeks, and there'd be no staff, and there would be no HR process for hiring staff, and there'd be no payroll process. So a new campaign trying to rapidly expand would have to focus on staffing, and they could probably hire people from the Biden campaign, but not everybody would want to work for a new candidate. Among the first people needed would be compliance and legal staff, because a new campaign would immediately be challenged on ballot access and all kinds of other stuff. I mean, if Biden steps down, the Republicans will still want to run against Biden, so they'll challenge every ballot change in every state.
Sure.
Probably lose, but they're going to do that, so you have to prepare and staff up for it because you know it's coming.
Yes. We were discussing that just the other day, that we already had the Ohio flap, and it forced the DNC to try and find a workaround so that they wouldn't.
Which they did, which is why we're going to have a early nomination process.
Right.
And it's not because they're panicking about Biden. It was because of Ohio.
Yeah, and Ohio would absolutely fight any change as well. Especially, I mean, if it fell after the deadline, they would say, "Look, we told you outright we were going to do this to Biden. What makes you think we're not going to do it to whoever replaces Biden?"
Right. So Dana goes through some other, practical things.
Okay.
Compliance would be needed to deal with the massive influx of immediate cash and to be sure everything meets FEC rules. But they get cash. Remember, we're Democrats, so we follow the rules. But to get cash, they'd need banking, accounting as well. So that needs to be set up, staffed up. Mm-hmm. And since most of the money would come in online, they'd need to immediately set up a web operation robust enough to handle it and secure enough to handle the obvious cyber attacks. So they'd need contracts for servers, support staff. This new campaign would be immediately inundated with calls and emails from press, volunteers, donors. So they would immediately need staff for press, scheduling, political. Dana's just outlining what it is to set up a campaign.
Yes.
All of it real, all of it practical,
logistics.
all of it you can't do overnight. So some of these peoples could probably slide over from DNC, but that leaves holes at the DNC and the state parties. Mm-hmm. But let's say they could staff up. Where does everybody work? Offices lease space that probably can't automatically be transferred. So they'd need to be renegotiated, new leases, new utilities. How do they communicate? Security breaches can be fatal, like we know from 2016. So it's not something that can be tossed together in a day.
True.
But let's say all the staff and infrastructure can be conjured from the ether. What about data? Some could probably be transferred. Some of it would probably need to be purchased at fair market value from Biden-Harris. The new campaign would be starting out with no email list, no volunteer list, no fundraising list. They'd be starting with no contracts with vendors. All those contracts would have to be negotiated again. The vendors wouldn't sign with the new campaign, so they'd need to be replaced, at least for those who don't want to do it. There's also the issue of advertising. Biden campaigns already reserved tens of millions of dollars of TV ad time for the last few weeks of the campaign, when the inventory is low and what's left is expensive. The new campaign probably wouldn't be able to get the same volume at the same prices. And then there's voter targeting data, and a lot of that is probably used for the DNC. But what about the plans and how to use it? As for money, well, you can't use the money from Biden-Harris except for Harris. So let's say all of that's in place. What's the plan? The new candidate would start without a campaign plan, without a budget. They'd have no polling. They'd have no data work, no research, no policy. And then they have to vet and choose a VP. So even if we live in a fantasy world where there'd be no issues with ballot access and state laws, you've got a situation where the political chaos of Biden not running and the first woman and African Asian American VP being passed over, the new candidate being untested in a primary season, it's impossible. It's
very daunting, no doubt about it. Although, as I was thinking or listening to all the issues, and they are very real, and of course you want to follow those rules because it's important, even if nobody else is going to follow the rules. But I was thinking all the way through, hey, wouldn't it be funny-ish if Citizens United actually rode to the rescue here, and you have the first presidential campaign conducted entirely by third-party super PAC. And there's no presidential campaign structure to speak of, but massive assets transferred over into relatively unregulated super PACs who just simply not... I mean, the whole campaign is likely to be anti-Trump in nature anyway, and so much the better if it is at this point without having vetted a new candidate. And so it's just massive billions of dollars of dark money super PAC expenditure against Trump. And there's no, sunny bio spot about the new candidate. Nay, who cares? It's all about stopping Trump anyway. The whole thing's an emergency. Well, it would be interesting to say the least. Well, then they would, of course, should they do such a thing, would immediately reverse or clamp down on Citizens United, giving us a clarifying ruling from the Supreme Court. Not for Democrats. You can't do that anymore. Republicans can continue to do that. So it's a one-shot thing, and it probably also wouldn't work. But, yeah, he makes great points about the real logistics of things. Things always take longer and are harder than you think, and I'm always fascinated
especially
by digging into...
Them. Yeah. He's done them, so he has a pretty good feel for,
yes.
If I were doing this, I'd be screwed.
Yeah, it would be very hard.
And that's not the word he would use.
Although, in all likelihood, of course, anybody that you would plug in at this point probably has a fairly sizable campaign machine behind them already anyway. Not a presidential one, and that's a quantum leap from any senatorial run anywhere. Pick any state, even the largest. But there is that, and there are email lists, and there are voter contact lists, and there are assets that you could transfer over from the new candidate would have under their control. And there would be, I assume, a lot more generosity with infrastructure and funding and break giving that would otherwise be extracting fees given the emergency situation. But you can't guarantee it. And even so, Yeah, like the things that he said, like literally getting people out there to like actually cable up a new office space so that you can have workstations and telephones will take you time that you really need to be up and running, and instead you're waiting for the cables to be laid in your new office. That's bad.
Right. So I posted on the Pundit Roundup
All right.
what I thought was a rather amusing, because mostly true, observation
it's true.
from Connor Sen.
All right.
And what he said is the Democratic Party is basically a coalition between Jim Clyburn and people who obsess over the New York Times Siena poll.
All right.
And what's interesting is today's
bones.
Wednesday,
Right.
and because the July 4th holiday is coming up,
Tomorrow.
everybody expects today the New York Times is going to drop their new Times Siena poll.
That's
And that was the expectation, and part of the reason why he wrote that. Okay, so now Elena Schneider tweets out, "Scoop, Biden campaign sends all staff memo seeking to calm internal fears, includes tracking polling data showing a still tight race. Biden dropped 0.5% post-debate and tries to get ahead of the New York Times poll, which is likely to show a slightly larger swing in the race."
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what's the expectation for the New York Times Siena poll? Probably something like a 5-point Trump lead, which is going to depress everybody. So
It would, yes.
if you thought that the Democrats are panicking after the debate, what I'm saying is, all right, that part of the coalition, the people who worry about New York Times Siena polls, that part of the coalition, they're going to have something to worry about today.
Yes, they will insist on having something to worry about. Even if it turns out wrong, not to be the case, they will insist. Well, next week probably will show that.
Right. I mean, the Clyburn part of the coalition is much more stable.
Yes.
Both mentally and in terms of how they vote.
Oh, yeah. All right. True. Okay. So Clyburn also much in the news for his own commentary on this because they realize he's got a named part of the coalition, for God's sake. You got to ask him what's going on.
So Clyburn says, "I'm sticking with Biden, but I'd be okay with Harris."
Okay. I mean,
good to know.
Me too.
Why did he say that? Why did he even add, "but I'm okay with Harris"? I think there's a lot going on under the surface, is what I think. Okay, right. And then Nancy Pelosi said things to the effect of the real issue here, and I said this the other day. I said this on Monday.
You did.
The real issue is whether the debate was a one-off or whether it's part of a condition.
Yes, I think that's the real issue. That sounds real.
But it's also the real concern. So
same thing.
That's why, again, I'm going to read you some New York Times headlines. I understand the Times is biased against Biden.
What?
But nonetheless, here are the headlines. Biden's team scrambles to contain first Democratic defections. Big donors turn on the president quietly. Some past supporters want a new candidate, but they're leery of going public. And then another piece here, President Biden's lapses are increasingly common, according to people who have spent time with him. This is really tough because when you read this story, they have a whole lot less there than meets the headline.
Oh.
And a lot of it is like Fox News nonsense. But it's there. Again, none of this is helping.
I can't find any part of it that's helping. That's true. All right. Yeah. I mean, okay. So the Times is doing its regular thing, but there is a grain of truth to it at the bottom. They may be exaggerating what they have in their headlines, and that's the only thing that people read. And if they read the story, they'll see that it's not so bad. But does that mean it's good? No, it's just not as bad as this headline, and it's just a different level of bad, and you need to do something. Okay, I can understand that analysis.
Right. So I think the worst would be to just yell at people for not being supportive of Biden. There's a whole lot more than just that going on.
Okay.
The reason people are upset is they want to win and they want to beat Trump, and that's what this is about. And I think all of us during the primary season back in 2020, had to acknowledge that Biden may not be the perfect candidate. He might be the perfect candidate for this race, but it's not like we're a cult and anything Biden does is okay. that was never and isn't ever the approach of the Democratic Party. We're not Republicans.
No, still not.
Still not. So, all I'm saying here is keep an open mind. We don't know what's going to wind up happening. But there are a lot of moving parts under the surface, and Biden has work to do to get the people who are upset not so upset. And so far, I have to say, based not only on the headlines, but my own talking to people, who are essentially Democrats who would vote for anybody who's not Donald Trump and who the Democrats are running, there's a lot of angst and upsetness about what's going on here. And it isn't just that, the media has a media frenzy, which they do. That's not all that's going on. There's a lot there for why that's happening. And there's a lot we don't know yet, and there's a lot yet to come. And I don't think this story's over. And that's why media is still covering it, among other reasons. Among the other reasons is to get oddballs and make money. But there's stuff behind this. And so it's not so easy to say, well, Trump should drop out. He should. Or that the Supreme Court just ended democracy. And, the Washington Post is putting it on A4, which is true. But this story is not going away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair enough. These are all other things that are true at the same time. But I've learned, over the years, okay, well, there's lots of explanations for why this might be the case, or there might even be adequate explanation for why Biden isn't doing the press availabilities that we think he needs to be doing. But the fact is he needs to be doing them, and they're not being done. I understand why, and it might even be a valid reason why, but I can't trade that for votes, can I? So if not, what can I trade for votes? What do you have that I can translate into votes? Everyone understands why. Okay, it's that he has a cold and he still can't go on TV and give a really good performance over the course of an hour. Understood. How can I get votes for that now? I can't? Oh, well, all right. Well, you're forgiven for not doing it, but I need another candidate. That's a reasonable conclusion. I think. I mean, there could be lots of explanations for it, but what are you going to do is always ultimately the question. So
right. So, again, I would counsel don't rush for judgment, but I would also counsel keep an open mind. Lots of moving parts. Story's not over. We don't know what's going to happen next. And worst for all of us, we really don't know Biden's current complete medical condition in terms of whether he sundowns or not, whether he does have, as the New York Times kindly put it, lapses. We don't know.
I don't.
And until Biden can convince us not an issue, it's an issue.
Guess so. Even if Trump also had exactly the same thing, it would still be an issue.
This is advice for Jennifer Rubin, again on Twitter.
Oh. Is that for her?
There's little evidence actual voters won't vote for him. If the disaster was so profound, the changes would be more than the margin of error. Well, let's see what the Times Siena poll says. Polling non-candidates who voters do not yet know is not predictive. Saying voters were worried doesn't mean he won't be the best candidate. We lack reliable evidence someone else wouldn't have done the 2-point incumbent advantage thing. And I think Kamala would do better is possible, but not grounded in real evidence, except for the recent CNN poll, which says she would. So Jen Rubin says, breathe, think, let events play out. I think that's great advice.
You have to.
And if Biden can't do it, he's going to have to go. And he will go.
Okay. Well, we could certainly see that develop. I'm open to it all, mostly because it would be, well, at the minimum, it would be fascinating to see, all right, well, what are we going to do? How will we arrange this? What will be the procedure? And I'm also sort of anxious to nail down the idea of, hey, by the way, besides just the infrastructure problem and logistics problem of saying, well, let's transfer it all to someone other than Kamala Harris, I'm anxious for people to start waking up to the issues with the coalition if you just say, we were just kidding about Kamala Harris. Ha ha ha. We need somebody else entirely. I don't know how you're going to make that work and not blow the whole thing up.
Exactly.
So
right.
I would like to see people come to that realization sooner rather than later. I understand
ask
the
Jim Clyburn
full
what he
emergency.
thinks of that idea.
Yeah, apparently he's said what he needs to say on that one. And it makes sense, and it made sense when he set the tone for the 2020 primaries, and it worked. And so maybe he knows something. Even though he's old too, he may know something after all.
Well, he won't be the nominee.
No, but I'm not saying that. I mean, he knows maybe which direction we should turn and where danger lies in straying from that. I mean, at this point, kind of you want, I would imagine, with all the logistical problems as Dana lays them out, you want as little disruption in other areas as possible.
The other question that we haven't addressed, which I think we should.
All right.
Not that we're solving all the problems of the world. If we could do that, we'd be working on Gaza and the Middle East. But timing.
Timing.
Let's say,
it's all timing.
For whatever reason, including Biden himself coming to the conclusion or Barry Goldwater telling him it's time, whatever the reason.
Barry Goldwater. Okay.
Well, he did that with Nixon.
Oh,
so,
I see.
The old heads of the party come in and say, the old bulls come in and say, it's time.
Not like Jacob Marley coming.
Yeah, Jacob Marley does it too.
Okay.
So
he could. He would have to do it
let's say
that
happens and Biden decides he really does, for whatever reason, need to step down.
All right.
Or Jill intervenes or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, his decision would make a lot of people move.
And by the way, before I forget, stories that Hunter Biden is now in on all the conversations and is now an advisor for the president are driving me nuts. It's a stupid conversation, but one that never should have happened.
Okay.
Campaign fail.
Yeah, and that's one of those things, too. Like, how do you tell him you can't go in? Like, you have to tackle him.
And tell him it's official campaign business. You're not supposed to be there.
Yeah, right.
Who does he think he is, Jared Kushner?
Maybe. He may think that. I mean, it's funny because Republicans think he thinks he's Jared Kushner.
Yeah, exactly. In any case.
Yes.
So getting that off my chest. The question is timing. When should Biden do this? And is it better to do it now, rip off the Band-Aid, and start this complicated process now? Or do you have time, and do you let it play out as Jen Rubin and Josh Marshall advise? And so that's not an easy answer. What do you think?
I think that at a minimum, I think that at this point, if it were already decided, given all of the logistics as Dana describes them about the difficulties of standing up someone else, even Kamala Harris, I think that a decision already made to step aside and letting it play out and making a decision later would look identical publicly. You would probably, if you had made the decision to step aside, you may say, well, okay, that's done, but what we need is for you to stay in place so that you legally retain the right, the power, the ability to transfer some of these assets to a different campaign, sign these papers. When you get done with all of these things, then you can announce your decision. I'm not certain it would look different, but I also don't believe that it wouldn't leak. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's Wednesday and July 4th is tomorrow. So I think you make a decision. And if you haven't made a decision, you have to do it over the July 4th recess.
Yeah.
And you have to announce something like next week.
Right. Also, though, that's true. So July is Congress currently in recess, or are they working?
I don't know. That's a Joan thing. I don't know.
Yeah, Joan, call up and tell me.
Thanksgiving is like in my office, we used to not work Thanksgiving, and I would never work the Friday after.
Yeah.
Because everybody who had an appointment to see me would cancel it and nobody would show up.
So I'm just thinking again in terms of logistics when Congress is out of session, and I assume they were planning to be out of session for the end of this week, which means they probably took off on Monday. But that makes things more difficult too. Like if you want to consult with members of Congress, yes, we have telephones and Zoom, but you have to track everybody down. They're elsewhere. They're in different time zones.
Punchbowl was able to consult with Congress. They sure got a whole lot of information.
Well, we think so. They said they did. They are all anonymous, but you can get five people. But well, not all of them, but one of them are not. But but that's a different thing. For the president of the United States to say, all right, I'm going to make this decision now. That and I need to talk with my closest advisors. That's not Lloyd Doggett. That's not
Jared
Camp.
Golden.
It's not
Or
Jared Golden.
Camp,
Right. Now, it is
Perez.
Clyburn and Pelosi, and we heard that they got on the record. So, it's not that they can't find all of them, but it does make it more difficult to assemble them. And they may very well have said, listen, the July 4th weekend will give us a somewhat more quiet period. We can round people up. We know people are in their districts, but we should be able to reach them. It may take some time. So, the plan could be in motion, but maybe that's just, wish casting too. I don't know. But, on the one hand, a well-executed plan for an exit might not look that much different than what we're seeing now. On the other hand, it's pretty hard to believe that no one leaks anything. The temptation to be the first one to the press, even anonymously, to say the ball's rolling.
Yeah, the ball is moving down
would
the field,
be
et cetera,
enormous, and I can't. It may be the final request of an outgoing president. I just beg you, please. I need you to freeze it in place and be quiet for 4 more days so that I can sign all the paperwork.
Well, given that it's a holiday weekend,
it
might happen.
Maybe,
that they can keep their mouth shut.
It's possible, right? Yeah, it's just more difficult to find the leakers and give them the opportunity to leak. They could call you and leave a voicemail, but
anyway, a lot of assumptions, but
yes,
but that's the way I'm looking at it.
Okay, and fireworks. You're going to be looking at that?
Oh, there's going to be fireworks.
Yeah. By the way, we have some believers, some originalists in my neighborhood who understand that John Adams, memorialized that July 2nd was going to be celebrated as Independence Day, the day they signed the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, what does he know?
Oh, yeah, right. That guy's an idiot. But apparently we have some originalists in the neighborhood. And they started firing off the fireworks last night. So it's
we got some of them too. My lovely dog Abby is really happy with them, I have to say.
Yes. When will dog Americans rise and make the people setting off fireworks? For the most part, are very often they overlap very heavily with.
Let's just say July 4th is Abby's least favorite holiday.
Yes, well, I can well imagine it, and also, what can I tell you? It's a big gun fail weekend as well. That's a big thing in America. All right, let's see. Oh, so tomorrow is July 4th. I assume you're going to be firing something off. We should take the day. It may be the last one that we can celebrate this way.
Yep.
And come back on Monday, and all the decisions will have been made, and all will be right with the world. I am looking forward to it.
Let's hope so.
Have a good, happy 4th of July weekend.
You too.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Greg has resigned, and Kamala Harris will be the co-host of the show. We're going to do a show tomorrow regardless because she's coming in, and we don't want to wait. I don't know. So, no, we haven't done that. But are you worried? Are you upset? Are you depressed? Do you need to... I thought I could cheer you all up earlier in the week by reminding you that Steve Bannon went to prison. But, of course... we now have to worry about that, as we mentioned in the top part of the show. Steve Bannon could very well now move to have his conviction thrown out under the new Supreme Court precedent, but it would take some time for them to do that, and it's a 4-month sentence, and it'd be very unlikely that things would move any quicker than he could actually serve the sentence. This would require Supreme Court decision in the end, and they're on vacation for the next 2 to 3 months, and unlikely that they'd be willing to reconvene to get Steve Bannon, the shambling mound, out of prison. But maybe the payoffs are lucrative enough for Thomas so that he presses his colleagues. And let's see, if he was reporting to prison now on July 1st, July, August, September, October is his 4th month. They'll reconvene, of course, the first Monday in October, so they could conceivably decide we want to meet to see what we can do about getting that 4th month of his prison sentence shaved off. But how long would it take them to make the decision, and have it briefed, et cetera, and have oral arguments? Maybe they could do it without oral arguments. They could move they could move on an emergency basis whenever they feel like it, and no one would have anything to say about it. But under normal circumstances, they probably wouldn't even meet again until his prison sentence was almost over. But they could vacate it afterwards. Anyway, there's that to think about. So, as depressing as that is, I guess I could give you this instead. Rudy Giuliani has been disbarred in New York. So that's something you can celebrate, and that's something that is a little more difficult for them to find a way to intervene and do something about. I am pretty sure that I had put aside some other stories about his disbarment, and yet I don't see them in my pocket saved stories. So it's a good thing that this morning over on Mastodon, remember Mastodon? I still maintain an account at Mastodon, that John Shiflett sent a couple of story suggestions, several of them, in fact, and I'm going to have to do some scrolling to make sure I see them all. But one of them was the Giuliani story, so I had a nice, easy link to it, and let's open it up and have a look, shall we? Let me do this in a way that won't totally disrupt the rest of Pocket, since I remember to do that. Giuliani, you remember him, right? There's a story about Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani, who is Rudolph William Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani to us, Rudolph W. Giuliani to the New York Times, but to the court, which is disbarring him, and is disbarring him in the name in which he registered as an attorney, admitted to the bar in New York, Rudolph William Giuliani. It becomes important. Here, the AP news story about it. I was pretty sure I had seen an NBC. I mean, everybody covered it, of course, but I don't know why the NBC news story didn't stick in Pocket. Anyway, Giuliani is disbarred in New York as court finds he repeatedly lied about Trump's 2020 election loss. Oh, by the way, I'm reminded by the use of the word lie in a headline. Fantastic. And all of that. I mean, it's true and everything. Let me just double back, by the way, and I want to admonish the anonymous Democrat quoted earlier in one of the pieces that Greg cited. I thought that was rather unnecessary and cowardly to do this anonymously, to choose that word, that we feel lied to. Now, I mean, again, for every other instance, I don't know why. Maybe they say these things all the time about Donald Trump as well, and so they like using the L word. But you couldn't. It's interesting that you chose to say and go with the anonymous quote that you felt lied to. You felt misled. You feel some other. I don't know. That seems interesting that you would go directly there, lay that charge down against the Biden campaign without softening it in the least, and then do it anonymously. I mean, it may still be true. I'm certain that describes your feelings, but it's interesting that you chose not to take care to couch these things in more reasonable terms. I don't know that you were lied to. You don't know that you were lied to. You feel lied to, but you were misled. You could say that, or at least you feel that you've been misled. And I don't know. Of course, no one will go through the exercise of insisting that this anonymous source prove the allegation that there was a lie involved. But it is interesting that in every other situation in the newspapers, when the newspapers have to come to the conclusion themselves about Donald Trump, it takes them 8 to 10 months to come around to maybe we should use the word lied. But if you provide it in a quote, they are able to run with it and short circuit the whole system. He did say lied. He may be wrong. He may be lying about the fact that he feels lied to. But we get to print it nonetheless, and you should be more responsible in your phrasing than that. You can still get the point across without having to go there. Thank you. Anyway, the other guy who did lie, and we know it, and it was proven, and so as a result, the courts are adjudicating something here. Giuliani disbarred in New York as court finds he repeatedly lied about Trump's 2020 election loss. So again, that's just something else to add to the score sheet. And it can serve, maybe purposefully, as a distraction from the debate, but there is this. Rather than tell the truth about what he knows about January 6th and what Trump did, and rather than tell the truth about the 2020 election and what Trump knew about it and what he did about it, rather than any of that, Steve Bannon opted instead, I'd rather serve prison time, and now he's doing it. Peter Navarro, similarly, rather than tell the truth about what Trump knew about the election and January 6th, I would prefer to sit in prison than say anything bad about dear leader. And now, Rudy Giuliani, rather than actually tell the truth about what the facts on the ground were about the election, I preferred to spin a web of lies in the hopes of seizing power for dear leader, and now I will lose my livelihood. And the thing that defined me in the public eye for many years, why was I America's mayor? I was America's mayor because I was a hard-nosed, tough prosecutor. Why was I the hard-nosed, tough prosecutor? Well, first and foremost, because I had a law license. Now I don't, because I lie too much. That's an important piece of the puzzle. And here's the way it's reported by Philip Marcello of the AP. Rudy Giuliani, the former New York City mayor, formerly mayor for life, but now not even a lawyer for life, by the way, federal prosecutor and legal advisor to Donald Trump, was disbarred in New York on Tuesday after a court found he repeatedly made false statements about Trump's 2020 election loss. The Manhattan Appeals Court ruled Giuliani, who had his New York law license suspended in 2021 for making false statements around the election, is no longer allowed to practice law in the state, effective immediately. Of course, he stopped practicing what would be universally recognized as law several years ago. But hey, now you can't even double back and attempt to study up and actually apply the law. It's not your business anymore. The seriousness of respondents' misconduct cannot be overstated, the decision reads. Giuliani, quote, flagrantly misused, unquote, his position and, quote, baselessly attacked and undermined the integrity of this country's electoral process, unquote. Why unquote? I don't know, because we're going right back into quoting. In doing so, respondent not only deliberately violated some of the most fundamental tenets of the legal profession, or at least as they existed up until yesterday, but he also actively contributed to the national strife, the long national nightmare, in fact, the national strife that has followed the 2020 presidential election, for which he is entirely unrepentant, the court wrote. Giuliani said Tuesday that he wasn't surprised to lose his law license in his hometown, claiming in a post on the social media platform, well, the one they call X, but we call Twitter, that the case was, quote, based on an activist complaint, replete with false arguments. Why didn't he post that on Truth Social? The former mob prosecutor, that is to say, at the time he was the enemy of the mob and prosecuting them, but now, of course, we understand him to be a prosecutor on behalf of the mob. The former mob prosecutor was admitted to the New York bar in 1969. But before pleading Trump's case in November 2020, Giuliani had not appeared in court as an attorney since 1992, according to court records. But he had the sort of performance in court that Biden had in the debate, and he got himself disbarred. A Giuliani spokesperson, Ted Goodman, said the man once dubbed America's mayor will appeal the objectively flawed decision by the mid-level state court. He also called on others in the legal community to speak out against the, quote, politically and ideologically corrupted decision. Giuliani's attorney, he had to get another one because he's not one anymore, Arthur Aidala, was more measured because he's still an attorney, of course, you see, and he's got a reputation and a license to protect. And he said his legal team was obviously disappointed, but not surprised by the decision. He said they put up a valiant effort to prevent the disbarment, but saw the writing on the wall. Giuliani argued in hearings held last October that he believed the claims he was making on behalf of the Trump campaign were true, but the court in its decision said it wasn't convinced. Contrary to respondents' allegations, there is nothing on the record before us that would permit the conclusion that the respondent lacked knowledge of the falsehood of the numerous statements that he made, and that he had in good faith basis to believe them to be true, the decision reads. Among other things, the court said it found that Giuliani falsely and dishonestly claimed during the 2020 presidential election that thousands of votes were cast in the names of dead people in Philadelphia, including a ballot in the name of the late boxing great Joe Frazier. He also falsely claimed that people were taken from nearby Camden, New Jersey to vote illegally in the Pennsylvania city, the court said. These false statements were made to improperly bolster respondents' narrative that due to widespread voter fraud, the victory in the 2020 United States presidential election was stolen from his client, the decision read. The disbarment comes amid mounting woes for the 80-year-old Giuliani. In May, WABC Radio suspended him and canceled his daily talk show because he refused to stop making false claims about the 2020 election. thereby imputing liability to them. They didn't want that happening on their air. Giuliani is also facing the possibility of losing his law license in Washington. A board in May recommended that he be disbarred, though a court has the final say, as they did here, and they said no to him in terms of continuing with his license. He's also filed for bankruptcy, of course, after being ordered to pay $148 million in damages to two former Georgia election workers over lies he spread about them that upended their lives with racist threats and harassment. Giuliani on Monday asked a federal judge to convert his bankruptcy case from a reorganization to a liquidation, which would mean that most of his assets would be sold off to pay what he owes creditors. It won't actually pay them. At the end of May, he had about $94,000 in cash on hand, while his company, Giuliani Communications, had about $237,000 in the bank, according to court documents. Giuliani is also facing criminal charges in Georgia and Arizona over his role in the effort to overturn the 2020 election. He has pleaded not guilty in both cases, but seems like the courts in the disbarment actions found reason not to believe him. We'll see whether criminal courts come to the same conclusion. He's charged in Georgia with making false statements and soliciting false testimony, conspiring to create phony paperwork, and asking state lawmakers to violate their oath of office to appoint an alternate slate of pro-Trump electors. The Arizona indictment accuses Giuliani of pressuring Maricopa County officials and state legislators to change the outcome of Arizona's results and encouraging Republican electors in the state to vote for Trump in December of 2020, i.e. the fake electors. Giuliani built his public persona by practicing law as the top federal prosecutor in Manhattan in the 1980s. When he went after mobsters, power brokers, and others, the law and order reputation helped catapult him into politics, governing the United States' most populous city when it was beset by high crime and misdemeanors. By the way, the Republican was lauded for holding the city together after the September 11th terror attacks when two hijacked planes slammed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, killing more than 2,700 people. I'm like glossing over this somehow. But I mean, yes, we all remember his September 11th role, but no mention here of course, the excessive number of emergency services personnel who it is alleged were killed because they couldn't get the message that they should evacuate the towers when it became obvious that they were going to collapse because their radios didn't work there. Although whether or not he had anything to do with that, well, he had something to do with, I guess, awarding the contract apparently to Motorola, but I don't think there's proof anywhere that they were clear, like, hey, by the way, these radios definitely don't work. Do you want them anyway? Because we could bribe you if you want. Yeah, sure. We don't know that part, I don't think. But anyway, after unsuccessful runs for the U.S. Senate and the presidency, and a lucrative career as a globe-trotting consultant, for no good reason, I would add, Giuliani smashed his image as a centrist who could get along with Democrats as he became one of Trump's most loyal defenders. He saw a big bunch of money in it, I guess. He was the primary mouthpiece for Trump's false claims of election fraud after the 2020 vote, infamously standing at a press conference in front of Four Seasons Total Landscaping. Wow, I can't even believe that ever happened. Outside Philadelphia, saying the campaign would challenge what he claimed was a vast conspiracy by Joe Biden and fellow Democrats. Lies around the election results helped push an angry mob of pro-Trump rioters to storm the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, in an effort to stop the certification of Biden's victory. You know, he's responsible for all of that. Okay. Anyway, that should cheer you to some extent. And I'm trying to think. I don't know if there's any way that the Trump absolute presidential immunity doctrine helps with disbarment, except that Trump could later assassinate the judges who went ahead with the disbarment decision, and that would be, an official act and therefore A-OK. So that would be problematic, I would guess. All right, let's see. Lots of other things to read into the record, some of which have to do with our continuing themes of what's going on in the courts. And let's see, why not, how about this one? Let's enter this one onto the record. There's so much. Where are we in the show here? I would like to we'll save this one for the last segment because it'll be heading into the July 4th weekend. And instead, let's read, some of the other news. Well, for one thing, oh yes, right, we need to get to this one. I had a feeling this one would eventually come around, even though there was really no reason for it. But the New York Times reports something you already know and probably have already forgotten about by now. And we'll just read to press you, but we're putting it on the record. New York Times report is what we'll read. Ben Protis, William Rashbaum, Kate Christobeck, and Wesley Parnell teaming up under the headline, Judge Delays Trump's Sentencing until September 18th after immunity claim. By the way, they couldn't get that one done a week early and do it on September 11th in New York City now? Well, anyway, Donald J. Trump's lawyers want to argue that the Supreme Court decision giving presidents immunity for official acts should void his felony convictions for covering up the hush money paid to a porn star, because everyone knows that porn star sex is an official act, even if it happens 10 years before your first election. You know, but the payoff took place later. And it, mostly took place during his campaign, but he didn't finish writing the checks to all the people who helped him with the cover-up until he was already president. And so therefore, it's all official acts from here on in, because why not make the claim? Now, look, all right, here's the facts of this situation. The judge in Donald Trump's Manhattan criminal case delayed his sentencing until September 18th for no good reason, to weigh whether a new U.S. Supreme Court ruling might imperil the former president's conviction, the judge said Tuesday in a letter to prosecutors and defense lawyers. The judge, Juan Merchan, may ultimately find no basis to overturn the jury's verdict, but the delay was a surprising turn of events in a case that has led to the first conviction of an American president. With the election on the horizon, the sentencing might be the only moment of criminal accountability for the twice impeached and 4-time indicted former president, well put, whose other cases are mired in delay. Mr. Trump, who was convicted of falsifying business records relating to his cover-up of a sex scandal during his 2016 presidential campaign. 2016, I like it. Was initially scheduled, that's not what they said, but I'm sticking with the screw-up, was initially scheduled to be sentenced July 11th, just days before he is to be formally nominated for president at the Republican National Convention. He faces up to 4 years in prison, though he could receive as little as a few weeks in jail or probation. I'm trying to decide whether I think the timing is actually not such a bad idea. Like September, he's nominated, people are actually paying attention, etc. The campaign is in like the home stretch essentially, and you're sentenced. And what if it's like, well, but you need to begin your sentence now? Like if you had to go inside. I mean, I think it increases the likelihood that judge does anything to avoid actually incarcerating him at that point. But if the judge is tough and hard-nosed about it and says, to hell with it, this whole place is going to hell, put him in prison. That'd be real interesting to watch for the closing stretch of the campaign. That guy's in prison. He's in prison right now. Anyway, but given the fact that he delayed the sentencing at all, I'm starting to think, no, Judge Merchan is still in let's be reasonable here mode, and that's the problem. On Monday, the planned sentencing hit a snag when the Supreme Court granted Mr. Trump broad immunity from prosecution. And they did grant it to Mr. Trump personally, not anybody else. Lest you think that this is really available to Biden. No, Biden can't send SEAL Team 6 to assassinate Trump because they would say, that's not what we meant. That's unofficial. And could Trump send SEAL Team 6 to assassinate Biden now? Or later? Now we're supposed to think, no, he's not president now. So maybe. But later, yes, sure, he can. Why? Because. Does it have to make sense? It doesn't. Do they even have to write the opinion down? I remind you once again, no, they don't. Anyway, on Monday, the planned sentencing hit a snag when the Supreme Court granted Mr. Trump broad immunity from prosecution for official actions taken as president, the landmark ruling, by which we mean the land has been erased and redrawn entirely, which was decided 6-3 along partisan lines, which they hate to do for landmark rulings, but they were willing to go along with it this time, dealt a major blow to Mr. Trump's federal criminal case in Washington, where he is accused of plotting to overturn his 2020 election loss. And people can see why it would deal a major blow to them, but why a major blow to the state charges of covering up his sex scandal in 2016? And the answer is, because I say so. And if the court will say so too, then you'll be forced to agree. The ruling appears to have little direct bearing on the Manhattan case, which concerns Mr. Trump's personal activity, for one thing, during the 2016 campaign, not his presidency or official acts. And Justice Merchan might be skeptical of Mr. Trump's effort to use the ruling to set aside his conviction, yet Mr. Trump's lawyers have argued that prosecutors built their case partly on evidence from his time in the White House. And under the Supreme Court's new ruling, prosecutors not only cannot charge a president for any official acts, but also cannot cite evidence involving official acts to bolster other accusations. In a letter to Justice Merchan, Trump's lawyers on Monday asked the judge to postpone the sentencing while he considered their request to set aside the conviction. In response, the district attorney's office wrote that prosecutors did not oppose Mr. Trump's request, which they really should have. Although we believe defendants' arguments to be without merit, we do not oppose his request for leave to file and his putative request to adjourn sentencing pending determination of his motion, wrote Joshua Steinglass, one of the assistant district attorneys who tried the case against the former president. What's happening here is, well, under normal circumstances, we would say, sure, let's take a few weeks to brief the whole thing, but this isn't normal circumstances. But they were trying to look like normal, everyday, accommodating professionals. So they just did the thing that they would normally do. And I mean, maybe the argument is, well, we're just treating them like we would treat any other defendant. But honest to God, this decision will be appealed regardless of what it is. So don't bother. Like, oh, everybody should take the time and study up and brief this thing to the best of your ability. No one can brief this case. It is an unbriefable point of law. It was just invented earlier this week. It doesn't have any basis in history or precedent. So how do you brief it? You argue, well, I mean, I think that this would be good for America. Well, yeah, well, I think it would be bad for America. Well, thank you for your briefs. And also, it doesn't matter. I've considered them. One side argued brilliantly, objectively, brilliantly, fantastic, so convincing. The other side, total debacle. Didn't have anything to do with history or law. Didn't even make an argument. It actually was a recitation of last night's box score from the Yankees-Red Sox game and nothing else. I have some questions about whether they accidentally cut and pasted things in their document. Are you sure this is what you wanted to file? And yet, in finding for the side that actually made a cogent argument and against the one that didn't even bother to file anything, I will be appealed and reversed. So what's the effing point? Don't brief a goddamn thing. We'll sentence you on July 11th. You'll appeal. Because I'm a reasonable guy, I will stay the imposition of sentence until the appeal is heard, and then you will appeal. And by the way, you'll be in New York State Court, and New York State Court will still say that none of this makes any sense. This Supreme Court decision is not applicable here. It's just not the same set of circumstances that they were aiming at. And then at some point, the Supreme Court will swoop in and say, no, we will be the one to review this case. The Supreme Court of the United States, not the Court of Appeals in New York, will take it. Oh, yes, by the way, you're immune, something. Go ahead. So what's the point in giving people time to study up to do the briefing? The Trump team isn't even going to bother taking the time that you give them to study up. They don't have to brief anything. So why you waiting? All right. Well, at any rate, back to the reporting. Mr. Trump's lawyers proposed filing their court papers on July 10th, and the district attorney's office said it would respond 2 weeks later. They got to study. Justice Merchan granted those requests on Tuesday and said he would rule on Mr. Trump's motion to set aside the verdict on September 6th. And then, if sentence, quote, is still necessary, the judge will impose it on September 18th, he said. The district attorney, Alvin Bragg, was the first to bring criminal charges against Trump last March. You know all about that. There's three other indictments following in other 3 jurisdictions, Washington, Florida, and Georgia. But Bragg's case is likely to be the only one to happen before Election Day. If he's reelected, the cases will almost certainly grind to a halt, i.e. be dismissed. In May, the jury convicted him. You know all about that, and you remember why it's for, Stormy Daniels. While paying hush money, we are reminded, is not inherently illegal, Bragg's prosecutors accused Trump of instructing his employees to lie on company paperwork to hide the nature of the reimbursement. You are aware of all of that. Yes, the effort to set aside the conviction might be a long shot. Much evidence in the case concerned Trump's conduct during the campaign and the transition after he was elected, as opposed to his time in the White House after he was sworn in. Although he was in the White House while signing the reimbursement checks to Mr. Cohen, Bragg has argued that doing so was a personal act. Oh well, that might be out the window now. At least one federal judge has already agreed with Bragg, but that was pre-decision from the Supreme Court. Before the trial, Trump tried to move the case to federal court, arguing that the evidence centered on his official acts as president, but a judge rejected that argument. That was Alvin Hellerstein, the judge, saying the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the matter was purely personal item of the president, a cover-up of an embarrassing event. But to F with all of that, we decide differently now. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time, just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So we were in the middle of the end of reading the New York Times article, and we sort of we got into the part where it was like, well, you know all of this already, but it's necessary background. But here we enter back into some more interesting speculation, give us some jumping off points here. We had just read, of course, that about the federal judge who upheld who rejected, I guess I should say, rejected Trump's motion to remove his Manhattan case to federal court. Right? He said, well, this was an official act because I was president at the time I finished paying off Michael Cohen. That was the claim, essentially. And a judge rejected that argument, but this was prior to Trump v. U.S., and that might change things. I don't know. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the matter was a purely personal item of the president, a cover-up of an embarrassing event. The judge, Alvin K. Hellerstein, wrote in an opinion last year. I mean, you could, at this point, say that where Trump's lawyers will say, well, in the Smith cases, which are still pending, we would like to see those remanded to the district courts with an order that they evaluate the personal versus official nature of the events for which Trump is charged. So they could simply, they could very easily, I think, extend this argument and say, well, we ought to have a reevaluation of whether or not the actions for which Trump has been convicted in New York should have been evaluated under this same standard and might still be evaluated under this standard if the Supreme Court were to order as much. Or if the New York courts were to imagine that they would be ordered to do as much. But there's already been a federal court finding that the Stormy Daniels situation, the payments, the payoffs to her, the payoffs to Cohen, the payoffs to everybody else involved, were non-official. That's a federal judge made that determination. Now, they could essentially say, we think you should reconsider, and we would ask you to reconsider in light of this decision, even though what this decision said is a federal judge should weigh whether or not the actions were official. And they have. Well, we think you came to the wrong conclusion. Well, what is it about the text of Trump v. U.S. that makes you think I got the conclusion wrong? And the answer is, essentially, because the president could kill you and get away with it if he doesn't like your decision. Do you want to reconsider it? Well, I considered already whether this was personal or official. And the answer is it's personal. Yes, but would you like to change your mind in light of the fact that murdering you could be done with impunity now? All right, well, that is a different question. If you're very, very brave, I already considered this. It's not official. He can't murder me for holding him to account for a non-official act. Even the Supreme Court in this stupid decision said that non-official act could still be prosecuted. That was what everybody was complaining about. The law professors who are writing, well, it's not, his power's not without limits. If he does it illegally, and is not making an official act, he could still be prosecuted. Yeah, he could be. But on the other hand, if he says that killing you for prosecuting him for the unofficial act is an official act, where do you go from there? I don't know. All right. Well, in that sense, I see that it is now applicable. I'll give it another look. Even the Supreme Court ruling on Monday, the New York Times helpfully notes, appeared in some measure to discourage Mr. Trump's effort to throw out the jury's verdict. In a footnote, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that a prosecutor may point to the public record to illustrate an argument, a provision that appeared to sweep in much of the evidence that Mr. Trump wants thrown out, including his tweets, public statements, and personal financial disclosure forms. One aspect of the prosecution's evidence that might be more vulnerable is testimony from former White House employees recounting meetings and conversations with President Trump. Prosecutors called Madeleine Westerhout, a former director of Oval Office operations, who testified about scheduling a February 2017 visit between Mr. Trump and Mr. Cohen, a meeting where Mr. Cohen says they discussed reimbursement for the hush money payment. Prosecutors also questioned Hope Hicks, Trump's former spokeswoman. How does she do it? Who testified about her discussion with the White House, in the White House, with Mr. Trump after the Wall Street Journal reported in 2018 about the hush money deal with Ms. Daniels. Mr. Trump's opinion was it was better to be dealing with it now, and that it would have been bad to have that story come out before the election, the 2016 election. Ms. Hicks recalled on the stand testimony that Mr. Steinglass, the prosecutor, referred to during his closing argument as devastating. But, how do you like this for a closing? It's unclear whether that conversation could constitute an official act simply by virtue of where it occurred in the White House. So therefore it's official. The end. If they want it to be. And during the trial, Justice Merchan appeared skeptical of the defense's argument that the prosecution should not question Ms. Hicks about that conversation. The objection is noted, he told Mr. Trump's lawyer, before allowing the testimony to proceed. And now they can say, of course, well, that was a clear judicial error. That testimony should never have been allowed because it was testimony about an official act and it cannot be brought into evidence. Would the jury have convicted me on all 34 counts had they not heard the devastating evidence from Hicks and from Westerhout? And therefore, without that evidence, Steinglass would never have been able to say that there was devastating evidence against me. Of course, he could have called someone else's evidence against you devastating. There is always that. But how do we know? How can we separate it in the minds of these jurors? We can't. And so therefore, the only thing we can do is set the verdict aside. If you want, you could retry the case, but I'll murder you all. which, by the way, he was threatening to do anyway, even before he found out he had presidential immunity, except he was contracting it out to his minions who were sending those death threats to the jury if they could identify them, members of the prosecution, members of the family members of the prosecutors, the judge, the clerks, everybody. But this time, the president could do it directly, or the guy who thinks he's president could do it directly and get away with it as well. All right. So, there's that, which is bad. Let's see. We already heard from the folks at Talking Points Memo today. And as much as they've written, the problem with Pocket today is there are a lot of very good descriptions of the situation we find ourselves in, but we already know the situation, so maybe it's not worth piling on in that sense. There is another crazy story out there. Save this one for not tomorrow. If we come back Friday, I guess. Let's do this because we're heading off into the July 4th weekend. This is sort of an interesting change of pace, I guess. This is an interesting story. Opinion piece in the Washington Post. Oh, no, not another one. Yes, another one, but slightly different. Gordon S. Wood has an opinion. Who's Gordon S. Wood? Well, good thing you asked. I wish there was an answer in italics at the top of the story. Oh, there is. Well, it's a short one. Gordon S. Wood is the author of The Radicalism of the American Revolution and winner of the 1993 Pulitzer Prize for History. It's a big prize. It's been a long time since 1993, but this is history, so it's okay. The older it is, the cooler it is. So there you go. What's he have to say? This is interesting. And, I don't know. I read this and I saw, this is what explains the genius of the American founders. This was the story I mentioned having seen on the Washington Post front page yesterday when I was looking for another story, which I did eventually find, but couldn't find on the front page in my initial sweep. And I thought, hey, that sounds interesting. And anyway, I wasn't certain whether it was relevant. So I didn't read it yesterday. Read it last night just because I was like, hey, by the way, do I want to talk about this? Let's find out. And I found that it was not directly, it wasn't direct commentary on what was happening in the courts and in politics, which, we demanded some focus the last couple of days. But this I find interesting, and maybe you'll find interesting too, just in terms of, well, what should we be doing? What should we be looking for in America in general? Or what are we losing, perhaps, in deciding instead? How about fascist dictatorship under the most venal a-hole ever? Oh, okay. We'll try that one instead. Okay, what explains the genius of the American founders? I don't know. Are they geniuses? Let's find out. Looked down on by England's ruling class, they reacted by redefining what it means to be civilized. I think we would be interested in what does it mean to be civilized, and how does that apply? It's an interesting story, I think. And so now I'm going to share it with you, and it'll be sort of, July 4th-y for you. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and we may not make it, we are bound to look back at the founding fathers, or founders, as our anti-patriarchal climate now prefers. I think I can acknowledge that. I can't tell whether he's doing so vituperatively or not. Am I using the word correctly there? All right. Well, anyway, I don't know how serious he is, but he is making that acknowledgement. But as we look back with somewhat different feelings from those we formerly had, I guess we're bound to look back at the founders with somewhat different feelings than those we formerly had. Although most generations of Americans conceived of the founders as larger than life, a forest of giant oaks, as Abraham Lincoln called them, we have tended to diminish them, seeing them as seriously flawed in matters of race, social equality, and the role of women. It is true. They did not think of themselves as aristocrats, and they were not embarrassed. Oh, I'm sorry. They did think of them. What am I saying? They did. I'm sorry. It is true. That is to say that they were seriously flawed. They did, think of themselves as aristocrats. You want to say that they didn't, but they did. They did think of themselves as aristocrats, if not titled nobility. And they were not embarrassed. There's the not embarrassed by their superiority to ordinary people. Many of them were enslavers, although some of them were the first in the world to legally abolish African slavery, those that lived long enough to have a hand in that. And there were certainly no women among them, for they mistakenly believed that women were too gentle and fragile to survive in the rough, tough world of politics. Still, when we set aside our present-minded criticism of the founders' backwardness, it is difficult to deny the originality of their thought and the creativity of their politics. They inspire in us both a sense of awe and an acute sense of loss. Where are our founding fathers in the age of Trump? Like, how did we trade to them for him? Well, they, as we say, inspired in us both a sense of awe and an acute sense of loss. We know that they possessed political and intellectual capacities well beyond our own, and we know that we will never see their likes again, or at least not that situation anyway. What accounts for the originality and creative genius of this singular generation of political leaders? Good question. The answer to which may be, well, maybe we would have had another such generation under different circumstances. But these notable North Americans lived in colonial societies that were different from the society of metropolitan England, the center of the British Empire. They were all very well aware, I added a very, but they were well aware of the luxury and sophistication of London, and were often embarrassed by the cultural deficiencies of their simpler provincial societies. But these differences from the self-satisfied mother country, disconcerting as they were, ultimately became important sources of their originality and creativity. It is astonishing that such extraordinary leaders were produced from a population of just a few million. Every colony on the eve of the Revolution had its share of brilliant politicians. Massachusetts had John and Samuel Adams. New York had Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. Pennsylvania had James Wilson and John Dickinson, but Virginia had the most. Yay! Although I'm originally from New Jersey, and they don't even get a mention. Harumph. On the eve of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the colony of Virginia contained only about 350,000 white inhabitants, roughly the size of present-day Wichita, Kansas. Yet this relatively small population created a dazzling array of leaders: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, George Mason, John Marshall, James Monroe, and others. And of course, had they lost, those would be just the names of a bunch of bums if we remembered who they were at all. But they didn't. All these men served in Virginia's legislature and were used to dealing with an electorate. Of all the colonies, Virginia had the largest percentage of white inhabitants qualified to vote in elections, and it usually had the highest rate of electoral participation as well. Despite the colony's extensive experience with elections, however, Virginians still lived in a pre-democratic world. These Virginian leaders and the leaders of other colonies knew they lived in enlightened times, and they were eager to adopt the new prescriptions for becoming polite and civilized, prescriptions that were associated with classical republicanism, lowercase r, of course. Traditional monarchists still defined aristocracies by the pride of their families, the size of their estates, the lavishness of their display, and the arrogance of their bearing. In other words, that was actually a tool for asserting power. The reason they, acted so arrogantly was not just because they felt that they were higher born than others, but because that was a key mechanism of power and control. Instead of language being the key mechanism of control, that arrogance was, and the lavishness of display was, right? You'd spend an inordinate amount of money on showing that you were a person of importance and influence, because you could do that because, law and civil society all sprang from the pleasure of the monarch. And to the extent that you were able to please him or show that you were a person of importance by pleasing others who were important to the monarch, then you enjoyed power and prestige and political control based on that. But others increasingly downplayed or ridiculed these characteristics, instead emphasizing those involving graciousness and civility. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, I didn't know that would be making an appearance, was all about getting these proper enlightened values straight. America's revolutionary leaders, by English standards, minor gentry at best, worked hard to adopt the new liberal characteristics that had come to define what it meant to be truly civilized: politeness, taste, sociability, learning, compassion, and benevolence. And also what it meant to be good political leaders, an aversion to corruption and to courtier-like behavior. Right? The real revolution here, in other words, is the redefinition of what it meant to be part, or what was expected of the political elite, and what it meant to be civilized, right? As opposed to being, I'm civilized despite the fact that I'm, personally depraved. I'm considered civilized and a leader in civil society because of the family I was born into and the haughtiness with which I carry myself, the displays I put on, the way I spend money, the people I trample on. And of course, that was all. It's an interesting thing. That itself, that order was had involved a revolution of its own, I guess, replacing just the marauder savage idea of and then redefining that as nobility, right? Instead of being a Viking type roving marauder raider with William the Conqueror, they converted themselves into nobility. Well, the savagery with which you slaughtered the local population and seized their lands is what makes you a noble person. And then over time, as that became less and less necessary, your gratuitous displays of haughtiness and expensive, lavish spending, and your ability to be proud of the fact that you could trace your lineage back to marauders, for whatever reason, was what made you noble. And if you're noble, then the things you do are noble too, and therefore that's how you become civilized, even if you're not particularly refined as a person. And then suddenly in the Age of Enlightenment, it becomes, well, if they read Latin and they study the treatises of the Greek philosophers and read Shakespeare and occasionally, stab a commoner or whatever and whore around and enslave people, that's still civilized. Then, of course, it becomes, well, everyone can, you don't have to be rich and wealthy and ostentatious and own a lot of things or come from a particular family in order to be polite, evidence taste and sociability, to learn things, to practice compassion and benevolence. All of those things are available to everyone. It's a very, broadening, opening of society. That's the Enlightenment for you. Anyone can do that, even minor gentry. Well, of course, even rabble, but they won't because they're more concerned with hand-to-mouth survival from day to day. But those of us who have lots of slaves, for instance, or servants of various kinds who will take care of the meaner necessities that we have, leave me time to study Latin and pretend, that there's a real reason why studying Latin makes me more enlightened. Well, okay, we get to more of why it might, and why it might make you more, I don't know what, if not noble in the old sense, then more entitled to a leadership role in society here in America. Anyway, America's revolutionary leaders, as we found out, by English standards, they were considered minor gentry at best, worked hard to adopt the new liberal characteristics that had come to define what it meant to be truly civilized. These were to their advantage, and so they worked hard to adopt them, right? And to convince everybody else to go along with the Enlightenment, which was an easy thing to do. Other people are doing it. We can go along with it too. And by the way, it just so happens that this will set me up as the pinnacle of society. Just as those operators dissatisfied with the Articles of Confederation congregated in Philadelphia and came up with a system that would instead reconstitute Congress with them in charge. So, wow, isn't that great? Anyway, these enlightened and classically Republican ideals, values, and standards came to circumscribe and control their behavior. That's interesting. Well, this is another interesting way of putting it. life became a theater, and the leaders became actors and characters. Jefferson was obsessed with politeness, despite enslaving people, and it became the source of much of his success in life. Washington always acted as if he were a character on a stage. Is that so? How interesting. The revolutionary leaders thus committed themselves to behaving in a certain moral, virtuous, and civilized manner, or at least what came to define those things. The intense, self-conscious seriousness with which they made that commitment is what ultimately separates them from later generations of American leaders. But that commitment also sets them sharply apart from the older world of their fathers and grandfathers. They sought, often unsuccessfully, but always sincerely, to play a part, to be what Jefferson called natural aristocrats, those who measured their status not by birth or family, but by enlightened values and benevolent behavior. Now, of course, that's out the window, and it might explain why we've degenerated so poorly. We're back to ostentatious display and virtue of birth, in some cases here in the United States, become more important. And, playing the part of virtue and benevolence has given way to, I am your vengeance. Well, anyway, the founding fathers, had good reason for doing so, for they were men of high ambition, yet of relatively modest or unrefined origins, and this combination made achieved rather than ascribed values naturally appealing to them. They could achieve these things. I can't just have them ascribed to me. I don't have that family background. I don't have that wealth. But I can affect these attributes, which are increasingly viewed as establishing one as civilized. So I'm going to do that. Almost all the revolutionary leaders, even the second and third ranks of leadership, were first-generation gentlemen. That is, almost all were the first in their families to attend college, to acquire a liberal arts education, and to display the new 18th century marks of an enlightened gentleman. Of the 89 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution, only 8 are known to have had fathers who attended college. The revolutionary leaders who did not attend college, such as Washington himself, Benjamin Franklin, and Nathaniel Greene, usually make up for this lack with intensive self-cultivation in the liberal enlightened values. And indeed they did. As the physician Benjamin Rush noted in 1790, many of the first men in America are the sons of reputable mechanics or farmers. That was an early Republican value, right? Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, was a successful Virginia planter and surveyor who married into the prestigious Randolph family, but he was not a refined and liberally educated gentleman. He did not read Latin. He did not know French. He did not play the violin. And as far as we know, he never questioned the idea of a religious establishment or the institution of slavery. His son Thomas was very different. Indeed, all the revolutionaries knew things that their fathers had not known, and they were eager to prove themselves by what they believed and valued, by their virtue and disinterestedness, that is, their enlightenment. There was one prominent revolutionary leader who did not seek to play the role that the others did. On the face of it, Aaron Burr had all the credentials for being a great founder. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, a Princeton graduate, and a charming and wealthy aristocrat. Burr eventually became a senator from New York and vice president of the United States, but unlike those other revolutionaries, Burr possessed a noble lineage, or notable lineage. John Adams said that he had, quote, never known in any country the prejudice in favor of birth, parentage, and descent more conspicuous than in the instance of Colonel Burr. Burr was the son of one president of Princeton. Gee whiz, how come he's a Princeton graduate? Even then, he was a legacy guy. Son of one president of Princeton and the grandson of another. Jonathan Edwards, the most famous theologian in 18th century America. Because of his distinguished ancestry, Burr took his aristocratic status for granted and felt no need whatsoever to emphasize his virtue. He never thought about politics and government the way the other founders did. He never expressed any ideas on political principles or constitutional matters, and seems to have had no vision for the nation. Compared with his colleagues, he wrote very few letters, always worried that they might miscarry and reveal his many nefarious schemes. Consequently, he also seemed to be promoting his own interests at the expense of the public good. His deviant character and behavior made him the great exception among the founders that proves the rule. Let's see how much more we can get through before exiting for the July 4th holiday. Many 18th century Englishmen shared these enlightened values and sought to become more cultivated and civilized, but they lacked the intensity and urgency of their North American cousins. English politics were dominated by about 400 noble families whose fabulous scale of landed wealth, political influence, and aristocratic grandeur was unmatched by anyone in North America. The English aristocrats were arrogant, complacent about their constitution, and unwilling to think freshly about most things. When they thought about the outlying and underdeveloped provinces of their greater British world at all, they tended to look down upon them with disdain. In the eyes of the English ruling class, not only North America, but Scotland was contemptible and barely civilized. The Americans and the Scots, as provincial people living on the edges of metropolitan English world, felt this disdain and reacted accordingly. Both lacked the presence of the hereditary noble families that were at the ruling center of English political life. America had never permanently attracted any of the aristocratic English families, and after the Acts of Union of 1707, the Scottish nobles tended to migrate to London, where the action was. Consequently, in both North America and Scotland, unlike in metropolitan England, the uppermost levels of society and its politics were dominated by minor gentry, male professionals, or relatively small landowners who were anxious to have their status determined less by their ancestry or the size of their estate and more by their behavior or their learning.
From netrootsradio.com.
We have indeed departed from that over the years.
Listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
No surprise then that the most ostentatiously wealthy pretender in the world has not only ascended to the heights of power in the United States, consequent or concomitant with our abandonment of those principles, but he has exercised that and turned it into the possibility of total dictatorship. See you again later.